Welcome to Psychology Daf. We are in Gemara Yoma Daf Vav. The Gemara Namad Aleph questions why the Kohen Gadol should be sequestered from his wife 7 days before the Yom Kippur service. And the Gemara answers that since there is only one Kohen Gadol, aside from the backup, we worry that if he lives with his wife, he may engage in sexual intercourse, which is not a problem in and of itself, because the next day he could become pure again by going to the mikvah. However, the fear is that if his wife becomes a nida right after intercourse, we might have to worry she was a nida during intercourse. And during intercourse, if a man has sexual relations with a woman who's a nida, he will become tameh for 7 days too. He will become ritually impure. So the Kohen Gadol would be invalidated from the service. Therefore, we instead have him not live with his wife 7 days before Yom Kippur. Now, there's a machlokas Rashi and Tosas over here that talks about the limits of psychological security, and it really is also machlokas l'shitasam in Kedushin Chav Testament Aleph, which I'll explain. Rashi learns here that the Kohen Gadol is being suggested by the Gemara. The Kohen Gadol should cohabit with his wife in the Lishkas Barhedron 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. Tosas raises an obvious objection. He says that we hold that someone who has seminal emissions, sexual or inadvertently while sleeping, is forbidden to be on the entire Temple Mount, on the Har HaBayis. Therefore, what could possibly be achieved by him staying with his wife? So Tosfos suggests a different approach, and is more clearly articulated by the Ritva. He says, let the Kohen Gadol enter the underground chambers. These were known as the Mechilos. And these underground chambers, although they were underneath the Har HaBayis, although they were underneath the Temple Mount, since the entrance was facing outside of the Temple Mount, they were considered not as consecrated. So he could then engage in sexual relations with his wife in those Mechilos. And the Ritva adds a key point, which is very important. It's not just that the Kohen could do this, but the Kohen should do this. Why should the Kohen do this? Because then, if he has a sexual outlet prior to Yom Kippur, we're less fearful and less concerned that Kohen Gadol might have a seminal emission on Yom Kippur night, invalidating him for the service, because it takes 1 day to be purified. He has to go to the mikveh and then wait until the sun sets. So the whole point that the Gemara is asking, according to the Ritva and Tosas, is why not let his wife stay with him during those 7 days, and when they want to have relations, let them enter into these underground chambers or some other place right off the Temple Mount. Now, what's clear from here is that Ritva and Tosfos hold that you need a concrete sexual outlet in order to achieve this security, that we don't worry about the seminal emission. However, we have to understand Rashi. Rashi had to have hold that it's forbidden for a person who has a seminal emission, someone who's Motzi Zera, to be on the Temple Mount, because Rashi never says anything different, and this is supported by many Gemaras. So what did Rashi have in mind here? What was being achieved? We have to conclude that Rashi held the idea of having his wife present, even though he did not engage in sexual intercourse with her, was itself enough psychological security that we don't worry as much that he would have a seminal emission on Yom Kippur Eve. If he really needed to be sexual with his wife, true, he could leave the Temple Mount, which Rashi had in mind. But the point is, the security came not by actually having a sexual outlet, but by having the ability, the possibility of it. And this exact machlokas occurs also in Gemara Kedushin Chav Tes Amud Beis. Over there, the Gemara discusses the difference, I think it's actually Chav Tes Amud Aleph, the Gemara there discusses the difference between Palestinian young Torah scholars and Babylonian young Torah scholars, Yerushalmis and the Bavliim. One group would marry first and then learn Torah. The other group would learn Torah and then marry first. The other group would then, yes, they learn Torah and then marry, not marry first. So basically there's a machlokas as to who would do what and why. Now, it's ambiguous in the Gemara who did what. It's not clear whether the Palestinians, whether Yerushalmis married first or the Bavliim married first. That itself is subject to a machlokas. But what are the two values that are being weighed over here? Well, if one marries early, they'll be saved from lustful and sinful thoughts and or behaviors. If one, on the other hand, though, if one waits to get married, they'll be freed from the burden of supporting a wife and family and diluting their Torah study. So there's two values battling against each other. Now Rashi learned that the Babylonian scholars, the Bavliim, would marry first, then go off to Eretz Yisrael and study Torah. And according to Rashi, that would be sufficient to relieve them of their sexual lustful burdens and thoughts. Tosas asks over there the obvious question: what good would it do if they're moving away? Not only they're not supporting their wives, but they're also not with their wives, so they're not getting any sexual outlet. And so Tosas reverses the scenario. Tosas says that actually the people in Eretz Yisrael would marry first and then study Torah, and that would not be such a big problem because there was relative affluence in Eretz Yisrael, and so the people were able to achieve that, to be able to be married and learn Torah without it disrupting their Torah study. The Babylonians would defer marriage. They would, so to speak, stay in the freezer, as is current yeshiva parlance. They would learn first, and go to Eretz Yisrael to learn, and then eventually they'd come back and get married. Now, we got to come back to Rashi. What did Rashi believe? You see from here, though, that Rashi held the psychological potential, the ability that let's say, this young scholar who got married first, then went off to Bavel to learn, even though he was now not with his wife, he felt relieved enough from the sexual pressures and the sexual anxiety. If he really wanted to go home, he could go home. He could take a week off and be with his wife if he wanted to do that. But he didn't need to do that anymore, and that was enough to stave off lust and sinful thoughts. On the other hand, Tosas holds you need something more concrete. So it's Rashi and Tosas Shitosam, both in our Gemara over here and the Gemara in Kedushin. This idea of whether or not it's enough to have the potential to be sexual in order to relieve lustful and sinful thoughts. Rashi on the side that potential is enough. Tosas saying no, one actually needs a sexual outlet in order to relieve those thoughts. So when it comes to responsibly managing our own sexual urges, we see two approaches, which in a practical sense can be equally valid depending on the person's emotional state. Sometimes a person can only satisfy and manage his or her libidinal urges with an actual sexual outlet, while at other times it may be sufficient to rely on psychological potential to be sexual, possibly other forms of emotional intimacy, like we see with Rashi, just being with one's wife, living together with her on the Temple Mount, even though the Kohen Gadol could not be sexual with her, was entertained as a possibility. And that is enough without having to actually engage in sexuality.